Hey guys, Lewis or the Gaming Rift here, and yes, I've had a haircut, but aside from that, we're back with another tier list. There's not very much to talk about, let's just get on with it. So today's tier list, guys, is going to be based on the Elden Ring classes. Now, for the benefit of those of you who aren't necessarily Souls fans, you might be thinking that picking your class is super important, and the answer to that is it isn't important at all. Essentially, your class dictates how easy of a start you're going to have, as well as it gives you a head start into a specific build. However, a few hours into the game, you'll be picking up weapons, armor, spells, and you'll be putting your levels into the stats you want to upgrade, meaning that a few hours in, your class choice will not matter in the slightest. Essentially, picking your class will give you a head start in a certain direction, as well as dictate how difficult the early game is. And I'm going to be ranking these classes based on if you weren't sure what build you wanted to go into and you wanted to do a hybrid build. As you've got to keep in mind that if you wanted to be a magic character, obviously the astrologer is double S tier. However, if you don't want to be a magic user, then, you know, it kind of depends. So I'm going to be ranking these classes on their overall effectiveness, as well as which ones I would recommend for new players. And just a heads up, guys, more than 80% of you aren't currently subscribed to the channel, so before we proceed to the tier list, make sure to drop a subscribe and like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and consider checking out my socials down below. With that being said, let's begin. That being said, guys, beginning with the bottom tier, we have a class that I'm sure you're all going to see coming. That is the Wretch. Now, the Wretch is down here mainly for, you know, this guy just has nothing going for him at the start of the game, as he has no proficiency in any category. He starts with 10 in every stat, which is pretty okay as he has no flaws, but he also has no perks either. Now, the trade-off to this, or I suppose, you know, the benefit to it, is that you start at level 1, whereas the other classes start, you know, between level 5 and level 10. But the problem with that is that this guy has no strong, you know, qualities in the early game. He also starts with no spells, no ranged weapons, no armor, and he's the only class to not start with a shield. You got to keep in mind that every class, even those with weak ass shields that don't protect you in the slightest, you know, they all still have shields. This guy doesn't have a shield, and he doesn't have any armor or any defense in the slightest. Now, he is good for experienced players in the series, as you can actually kind of get a head start early with the additional levels into a build of your choice. But for new players who have no idea what they're doing, this guy he has no redeeming qualities to him, and you should stay away from him, in my opinion. Now, moving up a tier into the alright tier, I'm essentially going to be putting 3 classes into every single tier just to give you guys a bit of range. And the first class that, oh, hold on, I've just realized it reset. The first class that's going to go into the alright tier is the Bandit. Now, the problem with the Bandit is he's essentially the same as, you know, the Thief class from previous games, you know, like in Dark Souls 1, you know, Dark Souls 3, that kind of carry on, where essentially this guy has above average dexterity and very good arcane. In fact, he actually starts with the most arcane out of any class at 14. In terms of gear, he actually is a step up from the Wretch. You know, he has a bit more versatility in the fact that he has a close range fast dagger, as well as a long range bow, as well as, you know, a small shield for parrying and stuff like that. So he has a lot more options going for him. However, his weapon, the dagger, is terrible. It's not good in the slightest. It's one of the weakest starting weapons. And in terms of stats, he's just kind of average to below average in everywhere other than Dex and Arcane, which I don't think is that good. Not to mention his armor does not protect you much in the slightest. I think you should stay away from this class. This next one might be a bit of a controversial take, guys, but the next class going into alright is going to be the Astrologer. And don't get me wrong, I can already hear my intelligence lovers screaming and getting the pitchforks ready. Hear me out, guys. Now, I'm looking at this from a beginner's perspective, you know, which class is going to be best for beginners. And looking at the Astrologer, he has some, you know, appealing qualities to him. You know, he starts with 2 spells, you know, one of them being a very good single projectile in Glintstone Pebble, the other being Glintstone Arc for dealing with multiple targets. Not to mention he starts with the highest intelligence out of all the classes at 16, which is very good. And in terms of a magic build, he is easily the strongest start. However, he is very lacking in pretty much everywhere else. If you don't want to do a magic build, you know, with sorcery, stay away from this class. You know, he has piss poor defense, very bad start for melee builds, and in my opinion, if you wanted you know, a magic based class, I would stick with the prisoner, because he also starts with, you know, one or two good spells, and he also starts with more defense and dexterity, which we'll get into later on. I think that astrologer, you're putting all your eggs in one basket, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you got to keep in mind beginners are not going to know where to get the good spells from, which is going to hold this class back, as you're essentially focusing all aspects into one, you know, combat style, that being magic, but you don't know as a beginner how to enhance your magic to its utmost capability. So astrologer, he's going just above the bandit for me. So the final class, guys, to go into the alright tier is going to be the hero, the strength orientated class. On paper, you might be thinking, why is the hero so low, as he's very good in, you know, a variety of melee-based, you know, perks, and on paper, you would be correct. You know, the hero is almost statistically the same to the warrior class from Dark Souls 3, in the sense that he starts with very high health and, you know, a very powerful starting weapon, the battle axe, not to mention he also starts with the highest strength stat, which is at 16, which is very, very good, and his defense is also above average. The problem, however, with the hero is just how lacking he is when it comes to magic as well as other builds. You know, he starts with 9 and 9 in in dex and mind, you know, the equivalent of attunement in this game, which isn't too bad. However, he has 7 and 8 in intelligence and faith respectively, so he is very, very restrictive early on if you're wanting to include a bit of magic into your build. In terms of arcane, he's above average. He has 11, which is pretty good, nothing mind-blowing, but it is nice to have. And the hero really just finds himself in this tier because there wasn't another tier that I could fit him in, as I think that the other 6 classes are just better than him. There's nothing really wrong with the hero. He's a fine start, especially if you want to hit enemies hard early on, but this is where I think he belongs in comparison to the other classes. Moving things off into the pretty good category, we have the Prophet, the miracles or incantations orientated class. Now, fun fact, guys, the Prophet is actually the class that I chose in my recent playthrough of Elden Ring, so I actually have quite a lot of insight into this character, more than the other classes, as he's the most recent one I chose. And to be honest, I was surprised at how good and solid of a choice this guy is. Now, let's get the obvious things out of the way. He starts with the highest faith scaling. He is the typical, you know, cleric, priest, that sort of character, and as a result he starts with incantations, and he starts with 2, and very good ones at that. That being a very solid healing spell for the early game, as well as Cast Flame, which is essentially this game's equivalent of the combustion spell. And whilst it has very, very, very small range, the power that this spell inflicts is genuinely astonishing and is on par with, you know, the damage that the astrologer exerts, albeit at much closer range and fire instead of magic. In terms of melee, he's actually pretty good, I'm surprised, as he's the only class that starts with a spear, meaning that he has long, sort of slower range strikes, which is pretty good when you're not that durable of a class. You know, you have someone like the Thief, where you're not that durable, but you have to get right in the enemy's face, which puts you at risk. Whereas with the Prophet, you can sort of stay back, relax, chill with the longer range, you know, and the safety that it provides to you. You know, he starts with 14 mind, the second highest mind stat, as well as being pretty average in, you know, the physicals. You know, he has 10 and 11 in, like, you know, vigor, endurance, strength, dex, that sort of thing. So he's okay for a magic build, as well as, you know, a melee build if you wanted to run a hybrid. The only problem is if you want to use sorceries, stay away from this character, as he starts with the lowest amount of intelligence out of all the classes at 7. But other than that, the Prophet is a very solid choice, and one that pleasantly surprised me during my recent playthrough. Following the Prophet into the, you know, the pretty good category, we have the next character, that being the warrior, the swordsman orientated class. And to be honest with you guys, this is the class that I have the least amount to say about, as in terms of stats, he's sort of above average when it comes to the melee capabilities. He has okay health, stamina and stuff, and he has the highest dexterity out of all the classes at 16, which pairs very well with his dual shuttle sword weapons, which he can use to, you know, basically be a very potent offensive class with melee early on. And that's pretty much all there is to him, you know. He doesn't start with any range in the slightest. His stats are okay if you want to lean towards a magic build. You know, he has 12 mind and 10 intelligence. That is all you need to start a sorcery orientated build. He's got kind of low faith in arcane, I suppose, but the warrior's just a solid choice. He's not bad. He's just good. I don't really know how to explain it, and I've got no more words other than that. He's just sort of a good class. The final class in the pretty good tier, in my opinion, is the Confessor. When discussing the Confessor, the only thing that I can really describe this class as being is basically an upgraded Wretch, where he's essentially a jack of all trades, where he's sort of good at everything but doesn't really excel in any one category, and that is basically how I can describe the Confessor. You know, he's basically a better Wretch. In terms of stats, he basically is superior to the Wretch in almost everything. You know, aside from 1 point in intelligence and arcane, which is easily fixable. You know, in terms of defense and melee capabilities, he is average to above average, as he has 10 in vigor and endurance, but he has 12 in both strength and dex, which makes him a very reliable melee option early on. His armor is also easily usable throughout the entire game. I used his armor on one of my recent characters. I think it looks fantastic in terms of fashion souls, but it's also very practical with its defense. He also has, you know, the capabilities being a hybrid to use incantations, as he has the second highest faith as well as a pretty respectable mind stat at 13. Going into his spells, he has the worst healing spell in the game, however it is still a healing spell nonetheless, and he also has an incantation which essentially works like Spook does from Dark Souls 3, where it silences your movement and removes fall damage, obviously being non-lethal fall damage, but it's still a spell that you can use throughout the entirety of the game, which I think is very useful. Compare that to the Prophet spells, which essentially will become obsolete as time goes on, whereas that particular spell is useful throughout the entirety of Elden Ring. Going into his gear, he has a broadsword, which is kind of good in every situation, as well as a shield that blocks 100% physical defense, making the Confessor a very well-rounded choice early on as he approaches every single playstyle. He doesn't have any range capabilities to start off with, but that is easily remedied, you know, later on in the game, and that is really his only flaw, keeping him out of top tier. The top tier of classes, guys, and the third best class in the game, in my opinion, is the Vagabond. The Vagabond is arguably most people's immediate go-to response when talking about the best classes in Elden Ring, and you can easily see why. He has the best physical defense as well as the highest health out of every class in the game, starting with 15 vigor. He's also very proficient in melee combat, having 14 strength and 13 dex, making him a very solid melee choice early on. Whilst he starts with no magic, he does have some pretty good magic potential, as he starts with 10 mind and 9 in both intelligence and faith, making him very versatile. Not to mention he starts with 2 completely separate weapons, that being the longsword and the halberd, meaning that whilst he has no ranged capability, he has 2 different melee weapons of 2 completely different styles, as one is, you know, a shorter range but faster, one of them's longer range, slower and more hard hitting, which adds a little bit of choice to him. His shield is also possibly the best starting shield out of any class. The real drawback to the Vagabond is if you equip all his gear starting off, you do move as a heavy load. However, this is easily rectifiable by simply just only having one of his weapons equipped. You know, if you want to equip both of them, you will need to pump points into endurance. However, just only equip one of his weapons and you will be just as fast as every other character, but with way more defense and being a strong melee option. Easily serviceable throughout the game. Just a step ahead of the Vagabond, however, we have the Prisoner. Now, if you're wanting to use incantations at all, do not pick the Prisoner, as he starts with the lowest faith at 6. You know, other characters start with low faith, but the Prisoner is terrible in this one stat. However, other than that, the Prisoner is a near perfect starting class. He is a strong, underrated melee class, as he's above average in pretty much all physicals, as well as starting with 14 dex, which pairs very well with his starting weapon, the thrusting sword or the S-Stock. It's a very fast, early, reliable weapon. However, he also starts as a very strong magic user, and in my opinion, better than the Astrologer, as the Astrologer basically puts all his eggs into one basket, that being spellcasting, whereas the Prisoner has pretty good magic early on. You know, he has the I can't remember what the spell's called, but he can essentially spam it, which is really, really good. You know, being able to spam magic at all is very, very strong. And coupled this with his, you know, above average melee potential, makes him a very reliable class early on, and in my opinion, the better hybrid. As whilst the Confessor is just sort of like a tank sort of, you know, character, the Prisoner has the versatility, has pretty good defense, and is very good at, you know, dealing damage out early on, and he is very serviceable throughout the game. And in fact, when I did a magic or a sorcerer run, I actually chose the Prisoner over the Astrologer, just because he's very, very versatile early on, and that really, really helps out, especially if you're a beginner, because when you run out of magic, you're essentially fucked as the Astrologer, whereas the Prisoner has that additional extra option with the thrusting sword, making him the better class overall and a near perfect class in my opinion. Last but certainly not least, we have the Samurai class. Really, the only drawbacks to the Samurai is his slightly low faith and arcane stats. That's pretty much it. Other than that, this guy is a near perfect class. The reason for this is because he has a definitely very, very good melee stats. Seriously, he has 12, 13, 12, and 15 in dex, that being his highest stat, which synchronizes very well with his starting weapon, the katana. And in my opinion, he has the best starting weapon, as he has bleed on his katana. And bleed, for those of you who don't know, in case you've been living under a rock, is very, very overpowered in Elden Ring. Seriously, bleed builds are very strong, and the fact that the Samurai starts with bleed damage is very good and makes him the most dangerous melee orientated class in the game, in my opinion. Not to mention, he also starts with range capability, as he starts with a bow, just like the Bandit. However, unlike the Bandit, he has very good physical defense, and he's also statistically well balanced, as he has high mind, and you know, he has 9 in intelligence, meaning that if you wanted to go a magic build with the Samurai, the options are there for you. And aside from having slightly low faith in arcane, there really are no drawbacks to this class, and he is, in my opinion, the most dangerous class to use as a melee user, but he also works well as a hybrid if you can get past the opening, you know, areas and, you know, cope without magic for a little bit. The Samurai will be the best option for you and is the strongest class in the game, in my opinion. With that being said though, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video of my tier list of the Elden Ring classes. If you agree or disagree with the video, or if it helps you start out playing Elden Ring, feel free to let me know in the comment section down below. As always, guys, like, comment, subscribe, it really helps me out on my road to 1,000 subscribers. That's all from me for today. This has been Lewis, or the Gaming Rift, and have a nice day, guys.